Hi, my name is Emily Swanson, and I've been an AAPOR member for 8 years.
I'm Hannah Fingerhut, and I've been a member nearly 5 years.
We're going to be talking about one of the unexpected ways that our research at the Associated Press shows partisanship playing out during the COVID-19 pandemic. To start off, we'd like to acknowledge the work of our colleague, Katie Perry, who's helped us with the graphics for this presentation. We're going to be looking at the results of several AP-NORC surveys conducted since March. All were conducted on NORC's probability-based AmeriSpeak panel and included about 1,000 US adults. Full methods details for all of these surveys can be found at apnorc.org. Way back in March, we noticed an interesting pattern. In states with Democratic governors, majorities of both Democrats and Republicans approved of how their state was handling the coronavirus outbreak. But in states with Republican governors, there was a partisan split. Most Republicans approved, but fewer Democrats did. This caught our eye because it's not the usual way partisanship plays out these days. You might expect to see a partisan split on both of these. One thing that was going on at this time is that most of those states with Democratic governors had already instituted stay-at-home orders when this poll began on March 26th, while most of those with Republican governors had not. And in fact, as the outbreak began, we actually saw almost no partisan gap in people's views on the response to the outbreak. As you can see here, Republicans were only slightly less likely than Democrats to support stay-at-home orders the first time we asked about this in March. That's changed a bit since then. By mid-May, a gap had started to open as Republicans became less likely to approve of stay-home orders. Yet it was still pretty close to half of Republicans who said that they supported these orders. So we're going to take a look at how things have developed since this March starting point, when states with Democratic governors had bipartisan support for handling the outbreak, while there was a partisan split on states with Republican governors. In states with Democratic governors, the pattern since then has been predictable. Democrats have been consistently supportive, with even a bit of an uptick in April, perhaps corresponding with more orders going into place. No surprises there. Republicans have become slightly less likely to say they approve of their state government's response in these states governed by Democrats. As a result, we see a partisan gap beginning to open up. It's not gigantic, but it's kind of what we might expect. In states with Republican governors, things get interesting. We've actually seen Democrats in these states have become more likely to approve of their state's handling of the outbreak, perhaps again giving credit for closures that they wanted. By April, nearly all states had instituted some kind of stay-home order, and most remained closed at the time of this May poll. But Republicans have actually become less likely to approve. In fact, the partisan gap we see now is almost identical to the one we saw in Democratic states, with Democrats somewhat more likely to approve than Republicans. So what's actually going on here? Well, recall that we saw overall support for stay-home orders sliding among Republicans, but still a solid percentage of Republicans favoring those orders. You can see here that among people who oppose stay-home orders, approval of the state government response has been consistently lower. This group is still too small to analyze by party over time, but it is predominantly Republican. Meanwhile, among both Democrats and Republicans who favor stay-home orders, and remember, this is still a pretty large chunk of Republicans, we've actually seen continued high support for state governments. So what we're actually seeing here is that the dip in Republican support for their state governments, even in state governments governed by Republicans, corresponds with that dip in support for stay-home orders. This appears to be happening in both Democratic and Republican governed states, and in both types of states, a significant subset of Republicans, those who favor stay-home orders, approve of their state government. It's a lot more complicated than the partisan patterns we've become accustomed to in recent years. Notably, as I said before, this May poll was conducted when only a couple of states had begun to reopen businesses. So it's a pattern that will continue to follow this month and beyond to find out what happens next and whether this continues to break the typical mold of partisanship. Thank you, and here's hoping we get to see you all in person to discuss all this in more detail next year.